Hi there, I'm Naj Alikhan. This is the ACSA Speaker Series, and we are honored today to be joined by Dr. Chris Emdin. Chris, tell me a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Well, I'm here right after a keynote at the ACSA conference where we had a really rousing conversation about humanity, about authenticity, about leadership, and about courage. And, where I challenged the educators or the superintendents a bit to reimagine what their role is as school leaders. And then also, had some conversation about how that informs pedagogy, like teaching and learning in the classroom.
When you talk about reimagining their role, their position, let's take it not just out as the superintendents, but just school leaders in general. Explain it.
I think that the word reimagining oftentimes gets sort of like thrown out there. People want to do something a little bit different and they say, I'm reimagining. For me, reimagining is about taking stock check of the existing structures, like really thinking thoroughly about what do I have in front of me? What structures are in place? Where are students academically? Where are teachers as far as their credentials and their effectiveness? What are parents' relationships to the school? What does the community think about the school? So, like, first of all, it's a taking stock check of how things exist, and then a really critical sort of internal dialogue about, does everything as it exists work well to meet the needs of all students? And if not, which is oftentimes the case, what am I going to do about each of those structures to enact them in a way that pushes back against existing norms, but most importantly, that meets the needs of the students within that group that at least have agency, that at least have a feeling as though they are part of what's going on. It's this idea of thinking about the structures of schools to allow the agency of those who've been most marginalized to create a new vision of what schools look like, where those who historically have been underserved and historically have been silenced to have voice, to be able to speak to what they need to have done to make things work differently.
Every student is so unique. Every school environment, every one of our communities is so unique. And with changing times, technology, politics, equity, race, the student itself, can you even really characterize a student right now, or is it too broad?
No, I think it's a powerful concept that you raise, right? Like the recognition that depending on context where one is embedded, the way that a person's identity is constructed will vary, right? Like, so a person in a particular school, in a particular neighborhood, with a particular history and background will have a relationship to schools, to schooling, even a relationship to the environment and to themselves that varies from somebody who's in somewhere different. I think that's what I want folks to understand, right? That there isn't a uniformity in teaching and learning, that we have to get comfortable with recognizing the fluidity in youth identities, but that there can be some uniformity in the methods we employ to be able to get to the nuances in how young folks construct who they are, right? So that somebody can be, really into technology and an English language learner that is a recent immigrant that loves comic books, right? And then there could be a young person in another place who's affluent, but doesn't have mom and dad at home all the time, but loves comic books. And that the young folks from different spaces that might be ethnically and racially different might have comic books in common. And that for them too, a comic book based pedagogy would work. But that there's also nuance. And I think it's getting comfortable with the discomfort of knowing that teaching and learning to be the best that it can be requires educators who are savvy enough to make themselves malleable to the particular needs of students, and that malleability is an ever-evolving process, that teachers and school leaders and principals have to be comfortable with not being static, and they have to understand that there's a skill set to be flowing. Like, for me, a word like flow, like teaching and learning is about flow. Really good school leadership is about flow. How do you know what you know, but still create space for flow? And how do you merge what you know with the flow of the students' rhythms and their realities to create the ideal pedagogy that meets the needs of those that you have right in front of you? And I know I've said a mouthful, but I think that, I get excited when I talk about this because I think we are in this really powerful space and time where I think folks are getting it. Like for the first time in history, I think teachers are recognizing, wait, that textbook alone is not going to do it. Like the curriculum they gave me alone is not going to get the kids to be agentic. And so we're in this moment where we're getting to the point where we are, catching up with the complexity and the speed of the complexity of students' lives. And it's magical.
But that requires educators to be empowered, not just by what they read in a book, not just the activities, but empowered by their students as well, correct?
Yeah, Naj, like, So, part of the conversation was today is like, you want to have folks who have power, like superintendents, to create the spaces for principals and for teachers to be able to pull on those things, right? And that's why the conversation today was really about like, okay, forget the students for a minute. And like, what? You're about teaching and learning. What do you mean forget the students? The students are the most important. I agree they're the most important, but you're the most important. Like in the hood, there's this phrase that that says, no matter what happens, secure the bag. And what that usually means is no matter what happens, make sure you get your check or make sure you get your money. But you are the bag. You are more valuable than money. Every teacher, every principal, every superintendent is the most essential piece. And so for me, the work is about how do you ensure that that individual is whole and comfortable in who they are, and free enough to be able to pull from things from their life experiences or that they're learning about and be okay to do that in the classroom. So you're right, it is about the agency of the person, but it's also about the person recognizing that you can't make a student feel whole unless you first understand what wholeness feels and sounds like. And so that self-work is the best service work. That if the self is intact, then you can do better service work. And like I just want folks to understand that nuance. And then that folks who have power create the space for folks to be able to do the self-work that they need to do to ensure they do the best service work by young people.
It seems to me that the definition of leadership, of leaders, evolves. When you talk especially about students and impacting students, empowering students, it doesn't mean that leadership is you're sitting at a desk moving paper around. It's something completely different.
Yeah, leadership is service. And the part about leadership where, that's different from a person who's not leading is that a person who's humble enough to recognize what they know and what they don't know, and they can surround themselves with the people who can fill in the gaps. And the greatest attribute for a phenomenal leader is humility. And so it's your knowledge, like you don't get to be a leader unless you have some knowledge about something, right? I have knowledge about school leadership. I know how schools run. I've read enough textbooks on leadership, so I have that. And then after the knowledge you have is your humility to recognize what you don't know, right? And then the willingness to allow people to be around you that can inform what you don't know, then you can lead them all forward. So leadership is not standing at the helm and saying, follow me. Leadership is knowing what you know. It's creating space for folks who can help you to be around you, and then together moving something forward.
You used a quote in your presentation today about, and it kind of follows in that, of you have a responsibility to not just be your best, but also to help those grow with you.
Absolutely. I mean, growth is an interesting thing, right? Because, one of my favorite thinkers is the late Maxine Greene. And one of the things she always said was, we never arrive, we're always becoming. And so people who operate from a place of growth to meet a destination point, or like, I've grown and now I am here. Like, I've grown, now I have a position, or I've grown and now I have a test score. They don't understand the concept of growth. So growth is an ever evolving, ever challenged phenomenon. It's growth is becoming. And knowing that in this world that we have, we are always becoming ideally better versions of ourselves. And then we are always in doing that, modeling for young people that they can do the same. So you want the adults who are in front of young people to always be moving towards becoming better versions of themselves so that young people can get the vision from the young person of what they can do, right? Good teaching is modeling, right? Good leadership is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And if we understood those really basic concepts and built systems around those ideas, we'd all collectively be better served.
You meet leaders when you go and speak in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
Not, I'm sure, just education leaders, but just leaders in big business, corporations, small towns. Can you compare and contrast leadership in education to some of the leadership that you see in other industries in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I mean, what the thing I found about leadership is, one, it's not a title. So I've met a lot of folks with a bunch of titles that would indicate that they were leaders, and have found that they were far from it. So that's the first part, right? And then the second part is like the best leaders I know actually don't have credentials and don't have platforms, but have movements that they can leverage to get things done. So I'll give you an example. There is, and when I say leaders, they're not people who I necessarily agree with all of their politics. It's people who I can identify the nuances of their construction of the concept of leadership that I think is powerful. So there's a rapper out in New York called My Son, right? My Son is a hip hop rapper. He committed a crime. He went to jail. He got out of jail, and has since then turned himself into a revolutionary of sorts. And my son can show up to an event in the Bronx and get thousands of people to show up with him and get them to really be committed to something that's bigger than them. That's a leader. He doesn't have a title as a leader. He doesn't have a position within an institution, but he has leadership skills. And then somebody who shall remain nameless that I had a conversation with recently, who was a mayor of a city. And he got elected as a mayor through a democratic process, got the position, and then turned into a tyrant. And so he has a leadership position, but he doesn't have a leadership sensibility or leadership mentality. And folks are merely following because they have to. And the minute they have an opportunity to do something in opposition to what his vision is, they will, because he has a leadership position, but does not have a leadership sensibility. And I think school leaders or leaders otherwise have to develop humility, but also a sensibility around what their goals and missions are, and then also have a spirit of service. All great leaders are in service of something bigger than themselves.
What's the next biggest challenge for students out there? Here comes a really broad question.
Yeah.
But what's like the next big challenge that maybe we aren't seeing right now as educators, as leaders, but is something that educators, leaders are going to have to confront?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for young people right now is that they have bought into the notion that their success on some assessment of something equates to their brilliance. So I encounter young people all the time who, just didn't do well on one exam, or, missed this thing by 2 points. And all of a sudden they're so crushed. And they define themselves by their success on a measure that does not have any ability to capture the complexities of the nuances or the beauty or the magic of who they are. And I think that what we've done in schools is we've imposed a kind of psychological trauma on young people where we've robbed them of their sense of self and robbed them of their agency and robbed them of seeing their own genius, because we've tethered their brilliance to a unitary form of success or assessment that does not measure the complexities of social life.
How can people learn more about you and your work?
I'm around, man. People can reach out to me on Instagram at Chris Emdin, or on social media at Chris Emdin, or follow my hashtag every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. Educators across the country, students, parents, convene on Twitter to have a dialogue about the intersections of hip hop culture and education. But it doesn't rest at hip hop. It's really about youth culture and education. How do we reimagine schooling? So I'm on social media, and I think that's the easiest way to communicate with me. And my book, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, is out. It's been out for a while. Folks should pick that up. And my newest book is almost done. Ratchetdemic, Reimagining Academic Excellence, should be out soon. And it speaks to a lot of what we talked about today.
All right, Dr. Chris Emdin.
Thank you guys for having me.
Watching Speaker Series. Thanks very much for joining us.